The kitchen was still dark when the moment happened. Steam lifted from a porcelain cup as coffee poured in a slow, steady stream. The only sound was the quiet hum of early morning in New Orleans, distant traffic, a faint horn from the river, the soft shuffle of house slippers across polished marble. Anita stood near the counter, hands folded tight in front of her apron. Eric stood beside her, small fingers gripping the hem of her skirt. His eyes moved across the enormous kitchen, the tall cabinets, the granite island, the chandelier above them, before settling on Weston. Weston didn't look up at first. He was checking something on his phone, half listening, half thinking about meetings and numbers. Eric swallowed. "Sir?" The coffee continued pouring. Weston glanced down briefly. "Yes." Eric's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I've never blown out candles." The coffee overflowed. It spilled over the rim and onto the marble counter, but Weston didn't move. The room stopped. Even the air felt suspended. Anita's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her apron, as if holding herself together. Eric looked confused by the silence. He thought he had simply answered a question no one asked. "I've never made a wish," he added softly. Weston stared at him now. Not as an employee's child, not as background noise, but as a boy, 4 years old, 4 years on this earth, and not once had he stood in front of a cake with candles flickering while people sang his name. Anita forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We don't need much," she said quickly. "He understands." But Eric didn't understand, and Weston suddenly did. Have you ever wanted something so small, so simple, that most people never even think about it? A cake, 4 candles, a wish. How many of us have taken that moment for granted? Right now, before we go any further, I need you to pause and do something important. Like this video, comment below, because stories like this deserve to be seen. When you interact, YouTube pushes it to more people, and more people need to hear what happens in this kitchen. A little boy who has never blown out candles, a mother trying to protect his dignity, and a billionaire who just realized he has been blind. Stay with me, because what Weston does next shocked everyone. Hours later, that same mansion no longer felt quiet. Music filled the air. Not background music, live jazz. A trumpet sang from the balcony, while a stand-up bass echoed across polished floors. Staff members who were usually silent and invisible stood shoulder to shoulder in the grand hall, dressed in their best. Laughter rose toward the crystal chandeliers. At the center of it all stood a towering cake, layered, frosted, glowing with candlelight. 4 candles. Eric stared at them as if they were stars pulled down from the sky. Anita stood frozen beside him, overwhelmed, unsure how this was real. And Weston stood in front of everyone, not in a boardroom, not behind a podium, but in his own home, facing the very people who cleaned it, cooked in it, maintained it. He lifted his hand, asking for silence. The jazz slowed. Conversations faded. Every eye turned toward him. His voice was steady, but something in his expression had changed. "I used to think success meant numbers," he began. "Revenue, growth, expansion." A few guests exchanged confused looks. Weston looked down at Eric, then at Anita. But I was wrong. A murmur moved through the room. Anita's heart pounded. Weston stepped forward. "I've decided tonight to change something." Gasps. Even the band stopped playing. Eric looked up at him with innocent trust. Anita's breath caught in her throat. Weston opened his mouth to say more, and that's when everything shifted. But to understand why that moment shook the room, to understand why a billionaire would risk reputation, status, and comfort in front of everyone he knew, we have to go back to the morning a little boy said 4 words that changed everything. "I've never blown out candles." Welcome to Mr. Gray Family, a storytelling universe built for people who crave meaning, emotion, and unforgettable narratives. Here, every story begins with a spark and ends with a feeling you'll carry long after the video ends. Love, betrayal, family, secrets, lessons, it's all here, wrapped in immersive narration that makes you forget everything else. If you're searching for stories that pull your heart, challenge your mind, and keep you coming back, subscribe now. Your story begins the moment you choose to stay. And if stories about faith, family, and second chances move you, you're exactly where you need to be. Because what happened in that mansion was not about money. It was about dignity. It was about a child's voice cutting through silence. It was about a decision that crossed a line most people never dare to cross. Before we return to that kitchen, ask yourself something. How many lives pass us every day that we never truly see? Stay with me. Let's go back to where it all began. Morning in the 9th Ward didn't arrive with silence. It arrived with sound. A distant trumpet practiced scales somewhere down the block. A delivery truck rattled over uneven pavement. Wind moved gently through narrow streets lined with pastel houses that had survived more storms than anyone cared to count. Anita stepped out onto the small front porch of her apartment building, just as the sky began turning gold over New Orleans. The air carried the scent of river water and last night's rain. She wrapped a faded scarf around her shoulders and inhaled slowly. For her, mornings were sacred, before uniforms, before cleaning supplies, before answering to someone else's schedule. She had grown up only a few blocks from here, raised by a mother who believed in two things without question: faith and music. Sundays meant church. Church meant choir. Choir meant discipline. As a girl, Anita had stood on wooden pews to reach the microphone, her voice steady even when the roof leaked during summer storms. She learned harmony before she learned hardship. She learned gratitude before she learned disappointment. Life had not followed the path she once imagined. There was no college degree hanging on her wall, no framed accomplishments, just rent due at the end of every month and a 4-year-old boy who depended on her for everything. Inside the apartment, Eric sat cross-legged on the living room floor, lining up plastic toy cars in careful rows. He hummed to himself, slightly off-key, copying the trumpet he heard outside. "Mama," he called softly. Anita stepped back in. "Yes, baby. Is tomorrow really my birthday?" She paused, only for a second. "Yes." His eyes brightened. "I'll be 5?" "4," she corrected gently, kneeling beside him. "You're turning 4." He considered that seriously, then smiled. "Do 4-year-olds get bigger cakes?" Her chest tightened. Cakes. The word landed heavier than it should have. In New Orleans, birthdays weren't quiet affairs. Families filled living rooms. Aunties brought trays of food. Neighbors stopped by without calling. Even when money was tight, someone found flour, sugar, candles. Anita remembered those nights vividly. Cousins laughing, hands clapping to off. Beats singing, wax dripping onto icing while everyone shouted, "Make a wish." Eric had never stood in the center of that circle. She smoothed his hair. "We'll celebrate," she said carefully. "How?" "With love," she answered first. He tilted his head. "And candles?" The question wasn't dramatic. It was hopeful. Children don't understand economics. They understand rituals. Anita stood and walked toward the kitchen sink, pretending to rinse a clean cup just to steady herself. Money had been tight for months. Extra shifts hadn't covered rising costs. Groceries were chosen by price per ounce. Electricity bills were paid down to the last possible day. There was no room in the budget for decorations. No room for bakery boxes tied with string. Eric wandered into the kitchen doorway. "I don't need a big one," he offered. "Just small." She turned, crouched in front of him, and placed both hands on his shoulders. "You deserve something special," she said firmly, almost to herself. Outside, the trumpet shifted into a lively melody. Sunlight pushed through the curtains, warming the worn tile beneath their feet. Eric leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her neck. "I like when you sing to me," he said. Her throat tightened. In that small apartment with chipped paint and secondhand furniture, she made a quiet decision. Whatever happened tomorrow, Eric would not feel forgotten, even if she had to borrow hope from somewhere else. The city outside prepared for another busy day. Tourists heading toward the French Quarter, business owners unlocking storefronts, delivery trucks rolling toward downtown towers. But inside that apartment, the only thing that mattered was a mother trying to stretch love far enough to cover what money could not. And she had no idea that before the next sunrise, her world would collide with someone who had never once worried about the price of candles. By the time the sun climbed higher over New Orleans, Anita and Eric were on the bus heading toward the Garden District. Eric sat by the window, watching houses change as the bus rolled forward. The paint grew fresher. The porches grew wider. Cars parked along the streets looked untouched by age. He didn't say anything. He just watched. Anita noticed the way his eyes followed everything. Children recognize contrast even when they don't understand it. When they stepped off the bus, the air felt different, quieter, less crowded. Oak trees stretched their branches across wide streets, casting shade over manicured lawns. Weston's mansion stood tall behind iron gates, polished stone, tall columns, windows reflecting the sky like mirrors. Anita adjusted her scarf before pressing the service entrance buzzer. The gate opened with a soft mechanical click. Inside, the floors gleamed. Chandeliers shimmered overhead. The scent of expensive cologne lingered faintly in the air. Eric instinctively lowered his voice. "Why is it so big?" he whispered. "Because it is," Anita replied gently. She tied her apron in the staff room, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her uniform. Her movements were precise, controlled. Dignity mattered, no matter where she stood. She handed Eric a small coloring book and crayons she kept in her bag. "Stay near the kitchen," she told him, "and be respectful." "I always am," he said earnestly. She believed him. Anita moved through the mansion with quiet efficiency, wiping counters, polishing silver, adjusting fresh flowers on the dining table. Each surface reflected back an image of abundance. The refrigerator alone held more food than her apartment kitchen could store in a month. She didn't resent it, but she felt it. Every unopened bottle of imported juice, every tray of catered desserts that would later be discarded untouched. Eric sat at the kitchen table, coloring carefully. Occasionally he glanced toward the grand staircase, where portraits lined the walls. Weston shaking hands with city officials, Weston standing in front of new construction projects downtown. Eric looked back down at his paper. He drew a square, then small lines on top. Anita walked past and paused. "What's that?" "A cake," he said. She swallowed. "Who's it for?" He looked up at her with innocent certainty. "Me." The word landed softly, but it carried weight. Anita forced her voice to stay steady. "That's beautiful." He added tiny circles on top of the square. "Those are lights," he explained. "Candles?" she asked quietly. He nodded. Her chest tightened, but she kept moving. She refused to let sadness show in a house where she worked hard to be composed. Later that afternoon, Weston passed through the kitchen without noticing the drawing. He was on a call, speaking about investments and timelines. Eric watched him from his seat. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One world spoke in millions. The other counted coins. When Weston exited, Eric leaned toward Anita. "Does he have birthdays?" Anita hesitated. "Yes." "Every year?" "Yes." "With candles?" She bent down to his level. "Some people have different lives," she answered carefully. "But that doesn't mean one life is worth more." He studied her face, processing that. She straightened up and returned to wiping the counter, though it was already spotless. The reality pressed harder now. Tomorrow was coming. She checked her phone discreetly during her break. Bank balance lower than she hoped. Hours available for extra shifts, none. Options limited. She closed her eyes briefly. Pride is a quiet burden. It keeps you standing, but it also keeps you silent. Anita had never asked Weston for anything beyond what her job required. She worked, she earned, she endured. But as she glanced at Eric's drawing one more time before they left for the day, she realized something. Dignity could not light candles, and love alone could not bake a cake. As the sun began to lower behind the oak trees, Anita gathered her bag and Eric's crayons. They stepped back through the iron gates into a different world. Eric held the drawing carefully against his chest. "Tomorrow," he said with certainty. Anita nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Tomorrow." The bus ride back to the 9th Ward felt longer than usual. Eric rested his head against Anita's arm, still holding the drawing he had made at the mansion. The crayon lines had smudged slightly, but the small circles above the square remained bright and intentional. Candles. Anita stared out the window as storefronts passed by in a blur. Her mind was calculating numbers that refused to stretch far enough. Rent, utilities, groceries, transportation. There was no hidden reserve, no emergency envelope tucked away for special occasions. By the time they reached their apartment building, dusk had settled over the street. A neighbor down the block was playing old jazz records through an open window. The melody drifted across cracked sidewalks and parked cars. Inside their apartment, the quiet returned. Eric placed the drawing carefully on the small table near the couch. "Can I put it on the wall tomorrow?" he asked. "Of course," Anita replied. He hesitated. "Will there be real ones?" She knew what he meant. Candles. Not drawn. Not imagined. Real. She walked to the sink, turning on the faucet just to buy herself a second. Her reflection in the small kitchen window looked tired. Not defeated, but tired. She turned back to him and knelt down so their eyes met evenly. "Yes," she said. The word came out steady. "Yes, baby. There will be candles." Eric's face lit up instantly. "How many?" She smiled softly. 4. He counted on his fingers to be sure. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he leaned forward and hugged her tightly. "I'm going to make the biggest wish," he said. Her arms wrapped around him, but her thoughts were racing. How? Borrow money? From who? Ask for an advance? Risk embarrassment? Buy a small grocery store cupcake and pretend it was enough? Pride whispered one thing. Motherhood demanded another. Later that night, after Eric had fallen asleep on the couch watching a cartoon with low volume, Anita sat alone at the kitchen table. The drawing was in front of her. She traced the outline of the crayon cake with her finger. Her promise echoed in her mind. There will be candles. She checked her phone again, scrolling through her banking app as if the numbers might magically increase. They didn't. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Faith had carried her through many things: storms, layoffs, loneliness. But faith did not automatically provide frosting and wax. She pressed her palms together, not in desperation, but in quiet resolve. "I'll figure it out," she whispered. From the couch, Eric stirred. "Mama?" She stood quickly and walked over. "I'm here. Do wishes really work?" The question came half asleep, half serious. She brushed his hair gently away from his forehead. "They can," she answered. "How?" "When you believe in something hard enough, sometimes life listens." He nodded faintly. "I'm going to wish for you to smile more." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because when you smile, the house feels bigger." For a moment, Anita couldn't speak. A 4-year-old boy had just revealed more awareness than she wanted him to carry. She kissed his forehead softly. "Go back to sleep," she murmured. After he drifted off again, she stood there in the dim light, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow was no longer just a date on a calendar. It was a test, not of wealth, not of status, but of her ability to protect her son from feeling less than anyone else. She walked back to the table, picked up the drawing, and pinned it carefully to the wall with a small tack. The crayon candles seemed to glow under the kitchen light. She had given her word, and tomorrow morning, when they returned to the mansion for work, she would carry that promise with her, whether she had a plan or not, because sometimes the hardest part of love is saying yes before you know how. Have you ever had to promise something you couldn't afford? The next morning began before sunrise, not for Anita this time, but for Weston. He woke to silence, not the kind that feels peaceful, the kind that feels engineered. His bedroom overlooked the garden district, where oak branches stretched across manicured lawns and historic facades stood in disciplined rows. Everything outside his window looked intentional, maintained, predictable, just like his life. Weston sat up in bed and checked his phone before his feet touched the floor. Overnight emails, market fluctuations, updates from overseas partners, numbers, projections, decisions waiting for him before breakfast. Control had built his empire. He believed in structure, preparation, precision. Nothing in his world moved without calculation. By 6:30 he was already dressed, tailored suit, polished shoes, cufflinks aligned. He walked downstairs as sunlight began filtering through tall windows. Anita was already in the kitchen. She moved quietly, efficiently, arranging breakfast on the terrace table, fresh fruit, brioche, coffee brewed to exact timing. She did not look at him directly unless necessary. Eric sat at the far end of the table with his coloring book close beside him today. He wasn't drawing. He was watching. Weston noticed that. Not consciously at first. Just a flicker of awareness. He took his seat. "Good morning," Anita said politely. "Morning," Weston replied, scanning messages. Eric's legs swung slightly under the chair. He studied Weston the way children study things they don't understand but find important. Weston sipped his coffee. He had grown up differently than most assumed. Yes, his family had money. Yes, his birthdays had been elaborate, but celebration had always been structured. Guest lists curated, photos staged, expectations defined. Joy had existed, but it had been scheduled. He rarely thought about that. As he buttered his toast, he heard Eric ask quietly, "Do you go to work every day?" Weston looked up. "Yes, even on your birthday." The question surprised him. "Usually," Weston answered. "Why?" "Because responsibility doesn't pause," he said automatically. Eric considered that. Anita shifted slightly, sensing the direction of the conversation. Weston returned to his phone, but something lingered. The boy's tone wasn't envious. It was curious. There was no bitterness in his eyes, just inquiry. After breakfast, Weston moved into his home office, a room lined with glass shelves and framed achievements. Awards from business magazines, photos from groundbreaking ceremonies, a skyline view of downtown New Orleans rising in the distance. He thrived in that space. Numbers made sense. Markets responded to logic. People in boardrooms understood leverage. But as he began reviewing quarterly projections, he found himself distracted by a small memory from minutes earlier, Eric watching him. Not intimidated, not impressed, just observing. Later that morning, Weston passed through the kitchen again on his way to a conference call. Anita was wiping down the counter. Eric sat at the table, unusually quiet. Weston slowed his steps, not enough to make it obvious. He heard Anita say softly, "Finish your milk." Eric nodded. There was something contained in the air between them, a tension Weston couldn't immediately identify. He paused near the doorway. "Everything all right?" he asked, almost casually. "Yes, sir," Anita replied quickly. Too quickly. Weston studied her expression for a second longer than usual. She looked composed, but her eyes carried weight. He continued walking. Back in his office, he dialed into his call. Voices filled his headset. Investors discussing expansion, projections, potential acquisitions. Weston spoke clearly, confidently, decisively, yet beneath his controlled exterior, a faint crack had formed. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the way Eric had asked about birthdays. Maybe it was the quietness from a child who had been more animated the day before. Maybe it was the subtle strain in Anita's voice. He told himself it was nothing. He had always maintained distance between business and personal matters. Staff were staff. Employees had boundaries. Professionalism ensured efficiency. But that morning, for the first time in years, Weston found himself wondering about a life that unfolded in the corners of his own home, a life he had never paused to examine. He ended his call and removed his headset slowly. From the hallway, he heard Eric's small voice drift toward the kitchen. Weston didn't intend to listen, but he didn't walk away either. And that choice, that slight delay, would position him exactly where he needed to be when 4 simple words changed the course of his carefully controlled world. Weston remained near the hallway entrance, unseen for a moment. Inside the kitchen, Anita stood at the counter slicing fruit with careful precision. Eric sat on one of the tall stools, elbows resting on the marble surface, chin in his hands. "Mama," Eric said softly. "Yes?" Anita didn't turn yet. "Tomorrow's still my birthday, right?" She paused mid-slice. "Yes, even if we're here?" "Yes, baby." Eric looked down at his fingers. "Do you think maybe this year I could make one?" Anita turned slowly. "Make one what?" "A wish." The word was fragile. Weston's hand tightened slightly against the doorway frame. Anita set the knife down. "You can always make wishes," she said carefully. Eric shook his head. "No, a real one." She stepped closer. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, as if embarrassed. "With lights, on a cake." There it was, the thing she had promised without knowing how to provide. Anita forced a calm expression. "We talked about this," she said gently. Eric's voice dropped further. "I've never made a wish." The words settled differently than they had in the hook. Not dramatic, not loud, just true. Weston stepped fully into the kitchen now. "I've never made a wish," Eric repeated, looking directly at him this time. "Because I've never had candles." Anita's breath caught. "Eric," she said quickly, a warning in her tone. But it wasn't anger. It was exposure. Weston looked from Eric to Anita. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller than the mansion it sat inside. "You've never?" Weston asked quietly. Eric shook his head. Anita straightened her posture. "It's not necessary," she said. "We celebrate in other ways." Weston studied her expression. He saw it now. The strain beneath her composure. The effort to protect her son's dignity while standing inside a home that could afford celebrations without noticing the cost. He remembered his own 4th birthday. A backyard filled with decorations, guests his parents barely knew. A cake so tall he couldn't see over it. He had blown out candles without understanding the privilege of that moment. For him, it had been routine. For Eric, it was unreachable. Weston pulled out a chair slowly and sat down across from them. "Why not?" he asked. Anita stiffened. "Sir, it's not your concern." Her voice was respectful but firm. Weston nodded once. "You're right," he said. "But I'm asking anyway." Silence, the kind that forces truth forward. Anita exhaled slowly. "Because sometimes," she began, choosing each word carefully, "when you're trying to make sure rent is paid and food is on the table, candles don't make the list." Eric looked between them, confused by adult language. Weston absorbed that sentence fully. He knew the statistics. He funded city projects. He attended meetings discussing economic disparity in New Orleans, how some neighborhoods averaged incomes below $30,000 a year while others tripled that amount without effort. He had signed checks addressing those gaps on paper, but this wasn't paper. This was a 4-year-old boy sitting in his kitchen. A child living in a city where wealth and struggle shared the same skyline but rarely the same table. Weston leaned forward. "How much is a cake?" he asked quietly. Anita's face flushed. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" "The point," she said, voice tightening, "is that I don't want my son thinking he needs what other people have to feel valued." Eric looked down at his hands again. Weston understood that instinct. Pride is powerful. He had built his career on it. But he also recognized something else rising inside him, not pity, responsibility. He looked at Eric again. "If you had candles," Weston asked gently, "what would you wish for?" Eric didn't hesitate. "For my mom to smile more." The answer struck harder than any financial report Weston had ever reviewed. Anita closed her eyes briefly. Embarrassment and gratitude collided inside her chest. Weston felt something shift, not in his bank account, not in his schedule, but in his priorities. He stood up slowly. "No child," he said quietly, almost to himself, "should miss a birthday because of numbers." Anita looked up sharply. "Sir," he raised a hand, not to silence her, but to pause the moment. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's common sense." Eric watched him with wide eyes. Weston turned toward the hallway. "I'll handle it." "Handle what?" Anita asked. Weston looked back at her. "Tomorrow." His voice was steady, but something in it carried weight. Not obligation, decision. For the first time, the walls of his controlled world felt insufficient. He had built towers, closed deals, influenced markets, yet he had overlooked something simple unfolding under his own roof. And that realization ignited something far stronger than discomfort. It ignited action. Weston did not return to his office. Instead, he walked upstairs to his study and closed the door quietly behind him. For several seconds, he stood still. He replayed the conversation in his mind, not the words alone, but the tone. The restraint in Anita's voice. The quiet honesty in Eric's. Numbers had always solved problems for him. So he reached for the simplest solution first. He opened his wallet, removed a crisp $100 bill, and paused. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the approach. He walked back downstairs. Anita was alone in the kitchen now. Eric had stepped into the living area with his coloring book. She looked up as Weston entered. "Sir, I apologize if—" "You don't need to apologize," he said calmly. He placed the folded bill gently on the counter near her hand. "This is for tomorrow." Anita stared at it. "I can't accept it." "Yes, you can." Her posture stiffened. "I work here. I don't ask for—" "And you didn't," he interrupted quietly. "He did." She looked toward the doorway, where Eric sat humming to himself. Weston lowered his voice. "This isn't about charity. It's about a child having a birthday." Anita hesitated. Accepting help meant admitting limits, but refusing it meant denying Eric something he had waited 4 years to experience. After a long moment, she picked up the bill slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but soft. Weston nodded once. "That's not all." Her eyes lifted. He pulled out his phone and stepped aside, dialing a number. When the call connected, his tone shifted. Efficient, direct. "I need a cake delivered tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Chocolate. 4 candles. Nothing extravagant, just done right." He listened briefly. "Yes. Address on file." He ended the call and turned back to Anita. "It'll arrive at your apartment." She blinked. "You didn't have to." "I know." There was no hesitation in his voice now, but he wasn't finished. Later that afternoon, Weston gathered the household staff in the main hall. They looked confused. Meetings like this were usually about schedules or protocol. "I want everyone available tomorrow evening," he said. "For what, sir?" someone asked cautiously. "A celebration." The word seemed unfamiliar in that room. Weston continued. "A birthday. In this house." A few exchanged surprised glances. "For Eric," he clarified. Silence followed. Weston saw it, disbelief mixed with curiosity. "This home runs because of the people in it," he added. "Tomorrow, we acknowledge that." He began assigning simple tasks, arranging tables, coordinating light refreshments, clearing the main hall. Nothing extravagant, just intentional. As instructions left his mouth, something inside him shifted further. For years he had invested in buildings and infrastructure. Now he was investing in a moment. That evening, as he reviewed emails in his office, he found it harder to concentrate on projections and acquisitions. His mind kept returning to a single image, Eric asking about wishes. Weston leaned back in his chair. He had always believed leadership meant growth and expansion, but maybe it also meant attention to what was happening under his own roof, attention to lives intersecting with his without recognition. If this moment moves you even slightly, if you believe every child deserves to feel seen, share this story. Because compassion spreads the same way indifference does, one decision at a time. Downstairs, Anita finished her shift, unaware of the full extent of Weston's plan. Eric walked beside her as they left the mansion that evening, unaware that tomorrow would look nothing like the birthdays he had imagined. And for the first time in years, Weston remained in the hallway after they exited, watching the door close behind them, not as an employer, but as a man who had just chosen to step outside the narrow lines he had drawn around his own life. Tomorrow would test that choice. The next afternoon, Weston did something unusual. He canceled a meeting, not rescheduled. Canceled. His assistant's silence on the other end of the phone lasted a second longer than normal. "Yes," Weston repeated. "Clear the hour." He walked downstairs and found Anita finishing light housekeeping in the living room. Eric sat cross-legged on the rug, building a small tower from wooden blocks kept in the corner of the house. "Anita," Weston said calmly, "are you finished for the afternoon?" She straightened slightly. "Almost, sir." "Good. I'd like you and Eric to come with me." Her brow furrowed. "Come with you?" "To City Park." Eric looked up instantly. "City Park?" he echoed. Weston nodded once. "You've been inside long enough." Anita hesitated. This wasn't part of her job description, but something in Weston's tone wasn't authoritative. It was intentional. "If you're sure," she said carefully. "I am." City Park stretched wide under the Louisiana sky. Ancient oak trees draped in moss, walking paths winding past open fields, families scattered across picnic blankets. The distant silhouette of the New Orleans Museum of Art stood quietly near the water. Eric stepped out of Weston's car and turned slowly in a circle. "It's huge," he said, eyes wide. Weston removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. "A rare sight." "Race you to that tree," Weston said suddenly, pointing toward a broad oak nearby. Eric didn't wait for clarification. He ran. Weston followed, not gracefully, not athletically, but fully. Anita stood back for a moment, stunned. The man who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking was now struggling to keep up with a 4-year-old in scuffed sneakers. Eric reached the tree first and threw his hands up triumphantly. "I win." Weston bent forward, catching his breath. "You cheated," he said between breaths. Eric laughed loudly. "I didn't." Weston dropped onto the grass beside him. "All right, rematch later." Anita approached slowly, unsure whether to join or observe. Weston looked up at her. "You're allowed to sit," he said lightly. She gave a faint smile and lowered herself onto the grass. For a few minutes, none of them spoke. Children ran nearby. A dog barked in the distance. Wind moved gently through the moss overhead. Weston picked up a small football from the trunk of his car. "You ever thrown one?" he asked Eric. Eric shook his head. Weston handed it to him. "Hold it like this." He adjusted Eric's grip carefully, guiding his small fingers into position. "Now aim for me." Eric threw it. The ball wobbled midair and landed short. Weston exaggerated a dramatic fall anyway. Oof, that was powerful. Eric burst into laughter. Try again, Weston encouraged. They repeated it again and again, each throw slightly better than the last. Anita watched quietly. She noticed something she had never seen inside the mansion walls. Weston wasn't guarded. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't calculating. He was present. At one point, Eric tripped lightly while chasing the ball. Before Anita could react, Weston was already kneeling beside him. "You okay?" Weston asked. Eric nodded, brushing grass from his knees. "Again," he insisted. Weston smiled, not the controlled smile he wore at business events. A genuine one. Anita felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't obligation. It wasn't guilt. It was engagement. Later, they sat on a bench overlooking Big Lake. Paddle boats drifted lazily across the water. Eric leaned against Weston's arm without hesitation. Weston didn't pull away. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on Eric's shoulder. "Do you come here a lot?" Weston asked Anita. "Not often," she admitted. "Transportation, work, it's not always easy." He absorbed that quietly. Another small realization. Accessibility isn't equal. Eric pointed toward the water. "Can we come back?" Weston looked at Anita first, not out of permission but respect. "If your mom says yes." Anita hesitated only briefly. "Yes." Eric grinned. Weston leaned back slightly, watching the lake. He hadn't visited City Park in years, not because he disliked it, but because he had convinced himself he didn't have time for things without measurable return. Yet sitting there now, he felt something different. Return wasn't always financial. Sometimes it was laughter echoing across open space. Sometimes it was a child leaning against you without hesitation. Anita glanced at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. There was no defensiveness in his voice, just certainty. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, casting warm light across the park, Eric tugged Weston's sleeve. "Rematch," he demanded. Weston stood. "All right," he said, "but this time, I'm winning." Eric sprinted ahead again. Weston followed, and for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing profit. He was chasing joy. The sun had begun to dip lower when Weston suggested they drive toward the French Quarter. "Hungry?" he asked casually. Eric nodded immediately. Anita hesitated. "We should head home soon." "We will," Weston assured her. "Just one stop." He parked near Jackson Square, where street performers gathered and tourists drifted between iron balconies and brick sidewalks. The Mississippi River moved steadily beyond the levee, constant and unhurried. The sign outside Café du Monde glowed warmly as they approached. Eric tugged Anita's hand. "What's this place?" "A tradition," Weston answered. They found a small metal table near the edge of the patio. The air carried the scent of fried dough and powdered sugar. Weston ordered without overthinking. 3 beignets, he said. Eric looked up. "What's a beignet?" "You're about to find out," Weston replied. When the plate arrived, stacked high and dusted white, Eric stared as if it were treasure. "Is that snow?" he whispered. Anita laughed softly. "Sugar." Eric took a careful bite. Powdered sugar clung to his cheeks instantly. Weston watched him and couldn't stop smiling. Anita noticed. "You don't seem like someone who sits at sidewalk tables often," she said gently. Weston leaned back slightly. "I used to," he replied. "When I was younger." "What changed?" "Ambition," he answered honestly. Eric licked sugar from his fingers, unaware of the shift in tone. Weston looked toward the cathedral rising across the square. "My parents believed success meant constant movement," he continued. "Every moment scheduled, every opportunity measured." Anita listened quietly. "Birthdays were large," he said, "but structured. Invitations sent weeks in advance, guests dressed properly, everything photographed." "That sounds nice," Anita said carefully. "It looked nice," Weston corrected. Eric reached for another beignet, focused entirely on the present. Weston's voice softened. "There weren't many moments where someone asked what I wanted. The celebration wasn't about me. It was about appearance." Anita absorbed that. "So you had candles," she said gently, "but not necessarily warmth." Weston looked at her, surprised by the precision of her words. Exactly. A musician nearby began playing trumpet. The melody drifted across the square, steady and soulful. Anita leaned forward slightly. I grew up differently, she said. We didn't have much, but Sundays, everyone showed up. Food was shared. If someone had $5, they made it stretch for everyone. Weston listened without interrupting. I always thought if I ever had a child, she continued, glancing at Eric, I wouldn't measure success by what I could buy. I'd measure it by whether he felt secure. Eric looked up briefly. I feel secure, he said confidently. Anita smiled. I know you do. Weston studied the way she said it. Not defensively, not proudly, just truthfully. What about your dreams? He asked suddenly. Anita paused. My dreams. Yes. Before responsibility took over, she hadn't expected that question. She looked down at her hands for a moment. I wanted to sing, she admitted. Not professionally, just more. I loved being in the church choir. I loved how music could fill a room and make people forget their worries for a few minutes. Weston nodded slowly. And now I sing to him, she said softly, brushing sugar from Eric's cheek. Eric grinned. She sings. Every night. Weston felt something tighten in his chest. Do you ever think about doing more? He asked. Anita shrugged gently. Life adjusts your priorities. The trumpet player nearby shifted into a brighter tune. Eric swayed slightly in his seat, still chewing. Weston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the small metal table. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think there's still time. Anita met his gaze. There was no condescension in his expression, no assumption, just belief. The moment lingered longer than either expected. Eric suddenly stood up in his chair and raised both arms. Look, I'm taller than both of you. Weston laughed. That's temporary. Anita shook her head, smiling. As twilight settled over Jackson Square, the lights around the patio flickered on softly. Weston realized something then. He had spent years building influence in boardrooms. But sitting across from Anita, listening to her speak about choir songs and shared meals, he felt more grounded than he had in a long time. When the check arrived, he paid without ceremony. As they stood to leave, powdered sugar still dusted lightly across the table. Anita spoke quietly. Thank you. For today. Weston nodded. It wasn't a favor. It was something else entirely, and both of them felt it beginning. By the time they returned to the mansion, the sky had shifted from gold to gray. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Eric pressed his face to the car window as the first drops began tapping against the glass. It's raining, he announced unnecessarily. Weston parked under the covered drive just as the rain strengthened, falling in steady sheets across the courtyard stones. Inside, the house felt different. Not colder, quieter. Anita moved toward the kitchen automatically. I'll clean up before we leave, she said. You don't have to, Weston replied. It's my job, she answered gently. Eric wandered toward the large window overlooking the garden, watching rain collect along the edges of the lawn. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the room in silver light. Weston loosened his tie and set it aside, another small shift from routine. In the kitchen, Anita rolled up her sleeves and began washing the few dishes left from earlier in the day. The faucet ran steadily, warm water filling the sink. Weston stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. You've been on your feet all day, he said. Let me. She glanced over her shoulder. You don't wash dishes. Today I do. Before she could argue, he stepped beside her and reached for a towel. Their hands brushed accidentally. Neither pulled away immediately. The rain intensified outside, tapping rhythmically against the windows. Eric turned from the glass. Can I help? He asked. You can dry, Weston said, handing him a small cloth. Eric stood on a stool between them, concentrating as he wiped water from a plate much too large for his hands. Anita laughed softly. Careful. I am, Eric insisted. Weston flicked a few drops of water lightly toward him. Eric gasped dramatically. You did that on purpose. Prove it. Weston challenged. Eric dipped his fingers into the sink and splashed back. Water droplets landed across Weston's sleeve. Anita shook her head. You two are impossible. Weston turned slightly and flicked a single drop toward her. It landed near her wrist. She froze for a second, surprised, before narrowing her eyes playfully. Sir, she warned, but her voice carried amusement. Eric laughed uncontrollably. The kitchen, once a space defined by hierarchy, felt lighter. For several minutes, they forgot roles, forgot distance, forgot expectation, just three people standing shoulder to shoulder while rain poured beyond thick glass. Eventually, the dishes were done. Eric climbed down from the stool and wandered toward the living room again, humming softly. Anita dried her hands and reached for her bag. Weston watched her carefully. "You don't have to rush off," he said. "It's late. I can drive you home." She hesitated. "You've already done enough today." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I didn't do it out of obligation." She looked up at him fully now. "I know," she said quietly. Lightning flashed again, closer this time. The lights flickered briefly before steadying. For a second, they stood only inches apart. No conversation, just awareness. Weston spoke first. "I built my life believing success meant accumulation," he said. "Property, contracts, influence." Anita listened. "But today," he continued slowly, "I felt something I haven't felt in years." "And what's that?" she asked. He considered the word carefully. "Purpose." The answer lingered between them. Not grand, not dramatic. Honest. Anita's expression softened. "Purpose doesn't always look like a boardroom," she said gently. He gave a faint smile. "I'm starting to understand that." From the other room, Eric called out, "Mama!" "I'm coming," she replied. She picked up her bag and turned toward the hallway. Weston walked beside her. At the door, rain still pouring steadily outside, he paused. "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "Yes?" "Be ready." "For what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the door, letting the cool, rain-scented air drift inside. "For something different." Anita studied his expression, searching for explanation. She didn't press further. Eric ran toward them, slipping his small hand into hers. "Good night," he said brightly to Weston. "Good night," Weston replied. As Anita stepped into the rain-covered drive with Eric, Weston remained under the shelter, watching them walk toward the car. The storm continued overhead, steady and cleansing. For years, Weston had measured his life by acquisition. Tonight, standing alone in the doorway after they drove away, he recognized something unmistakable. He wanted more than success. He wanted connection, and tomorrow would prove whether he was willing to pursue it fully. The next evening arrived with a different energy. Anita noticed it immediately. When she and Eric stepped through the iron gates, the mansion did not feel routine. It felt prepared. Lights glowed brighter along the driveway. Windows reflected movement inside. Even the air carried a faint vibration, not tension, but anticipation. "Mama," Eric whispered, gripping her hand. "Is something happening?" Anita frowned slightly. "I'm not sure." Inside, the foyer no longer echoed with stillness. Soft music drifted from the main hall, live, unmistakable. A trumpet led the melody. A stand-up bass followed closely. The rhythm moved through the marble floors and up the grand staircase. Eric's eyes widened. "That's real music," he said. "Yes," Anita replied softly. They stepped further in. The main hall had been rearranged. Tables lined the walls, covered in crisp white linens. Strings of warm lights hung subtly between columns. The usual formal atmosphere had softened into something welcoming. Staff members who typically moved quietly now stood gathered in small groups, dressed more casually than usual. Some smiled when they saw Eric. Anita's pulse quickened. She turned toward Weston, who stood near the center of the room speaking quietly with someone from the band. He saw them immediately, and he smiled. Not the restrained smile she had first known. Something broader, intentional. "Right on time," he said, walking toward them. "Sir," Anita began carefully. "What is this?" Weston looked down at Eric. "It's Thursday," he said lightly. Eric blinked. So, Weston continued. Thursday seemed like a good day for music. Before Anita could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Anita." She froze. Slowly, she turned. Standing near the entryway, wearing her best Sunday dress, was her mother. Anita's breath left her completely. "Mama?" she whispered. Her mother stepped forward, smiling warmly. "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Anita looked back at Weston, stunned. "You?" "I made a call," Weston said simply. Anita's eyes filled instantly. Eric ran forward. "Grandma." he shouted, wrapping his arms around her waist. Her mother laughed softly and bent to hug him tightly. "You look handsome," she said. Eric pulled back. "Why are you here?" She glanced toward Weston, then back at Eric. "Because tonight matters." The band shifted into a brighter tune, filling the hall with rhythm. Staff members began clapping lightly along. Anita felt her composure slipping. This was no small gesture. This was effort. Weston stepped closer to her. "I told you to be ready," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked again, voice trembling. He gestured toward the far end of the hall. 2 staff members rolled out a table covered in deep blue cloth. The music softened slightly. Eric followed the movement instinctively. Anita's heart pounded in her ears. The cloth was lifted, and there it was. A tall chocolate cake, layered carefully, frosting smooth and rich, 4 unlit candles standing proudly at the top. Eric stopped walking. His eyes locked onto it. For several seconds he didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared. "Is that—" he began. "Yes," Weston answered gently. The room grew quiet, not out of obligation, but respect. Eric looked at Anita. "Is it for someone?" Anita's hand covered her mouth. Weston knelt slightly so he was level with Eric. "It's for you." The words landed fully. Eric's expression shifted from disbelief to understanding in stages. "For me," he whispered. "For you." Anita felt tears slide down her cheeks freely now. Her mother squeezed her hand. Staff members watched closely, some smiling, some wiping their own eyes discreetly. The mansion, once a symbol of separation, now felt like a gathering place. Eric took a slow step forward, then another. He circled the table once, studying the cake from every angle. "It's big," he said softly. Weston nodded. "You're 4. Eric turned back toward him. "You remembered?" Weston held his gaze. "I listened." The band paused gently, allowing the moment to breathe. Anita stood there, overwhelmed not by the cake itself, but by what it represented. Effort, attention, care. Eric reached out, but stopped just short of touching the frosting. "Can I?" he asked. "Not yet," Weston said with a small smile. "There's one more thing." He looked toward the band. The trumpet lifted, and the first notes of Happy Birthday filled the hall. The trumpet softened, and the room leaned inward. Weston reached into his pocket and pulled out a small lighter. He didn't rush. He struck the flame once. A small golden spark appeared. One by one, he lit the candles. The first flame flickered uncertainly before standing tall. The second followed. The third caught quickly. The fourth glowed steady and bright. 4 small lights. Simple, but in that moment, they commanded the entire room. Eric stood perfectly still. The glow reflected in his wide eyes, dancing against the chocolate frosting. Anita's breathing grew uneven. She had imagined this moment 100 times, in smaller forms, in quieter rooms, but never like this. The band began singing, not loudly, not theatrically, just sincerely. "Happy birthday to you." Staff members joined in. Anita's mother sang clearly, her voice steady from years in the church choir. Eric looked around as if confirming it was real. They were singing his name. "Happy birthday, dear Eric." His lower lip trembled slightly. Weston remained kneeling beside him, not directing the moment, not controlling it, just witnessing it. As the final note faded, the room fell silent. Weston leaned closer. "This is where you make your wish," he said quietly. Eric nodded slowly. He clasped his hands together instinctively, the way he had seen his mother do before meals. Anita noticed. So did her mother. The gesture wasn't rehearsed. It was learned, faith passed down without instruction. Eric closed his eyes. The room remained still. No phones raised. No interruptions. Just quiet belief. Anita pressed her fingers to her lips, tears flowing freely now. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall. Eric opened his eyes again. He leaned forward, and he blew. All 4 flames disappeared at once. A thin trail of smoke rose gently toward the ceiling. For a split second, there was silence. Then the room erupted in applause. Not polite applause. Joyful, full. Anita dropped to her knees beside Eric, pulling him into her arms. "You did it," she whispered through tears. "I did," he said breathlessly. Weston remained close, watching the embrace. Eric pulled back slightly. "Does that mean it comes true?" he asked. Anita cupped his face. "Sometimes," she answered. Weston looked at him carefully. "What did you wish for?" Eric hesitated, glancing between them. "If I tell, it won't happen." Weston smiled softly. "Fair enough." Staff members began stepping forward, offering hugs, pats on the back, warm congratulations. Anita's mother approached next, placing her hands on Eric's shoulders. "I've been waiting for this day," she said. Eric beamed. Anita looked at Weston. "You didn't just buy a cake," she said quietly. "No," he replied. He hadn't. He had restored something. The band shifted into a lively jazz tune, brighter now, encouraging movement. A few staff members began clapping along again. Weston stood and extended his hand toward Eric. "First slice is yours," he said. Eric looked up at him with open trust. "Can you help me cut it?" Weston nodded. Together, they held the knife. Anita watched as the blade pressed gently through the frosting and down into the layers beneath. The first slice lifted cleanly. Weston handed the plate to Eric. "Birthday privilege," he said. Eric took a bite. Chocolate frosting smudged across his cheek instantly. He laughed. Real, uninhibited laughter. Anita felt something release inside her chest that she had been holding for years. Not just relief. Gratitude. She glanced upward briefly, not toward the chandelier but beyond it, offering silent thanks. This moment was bigger than status, bigger than income. It was community. It was acknowledgement. It was a room full of people choosing to celebrate one small life fully. Weston stepped closer to Anita. "I meant what I said," he murmured. She looked at him. "When?" "In the kitchen. No child should miss this." Her voice trembled slightly. "You changed more than tonight." He held her gaze. "I'm just getting started." The music continued. Laughter spread. Plates were passed. Conversations flowed easily between staff and guests who normally moved through separate roles. The mansion felt transformed, not by decoration, but by participation. Eric stood at the center of it all, cake in hand, smiling wider than Anita had ever seen. 4 candles had burned. 4 flames had gone out, but something far brighter had been lit in their place. And the night wasn't finished yet. The music continued for several more minutes, light and celebratory. Plates were refilled. Conversations overlapped. Laughter echoed against marble and glass. Eric moved between guests, proudly, holding his slice of cake as if it were a trophy. Anita stood near the center of the hall, her mother beside her, absorbing everything. Weston watched quietly. He allowed the joy to settle before acting. Then he lifted one hand slightly. The trumpet slowed. The bass softened. Gradually, the music faded. Conversations tapered off. Attention shifted toward him naturally. He stepped forward into the open space near the cake table. For a brief moment, he said nothing. He simply looked around the room. At the staff who kept his home running. At Anita's mother standing with quiet pride. At Eric, still smiling, unaware of what was about to unfold. Finally, Weston spoke. "I've hosted many gatherings in this house," he began calmly. "Business dinners, fundraisers, strategy meetings." A few staff members exchanged curious glances. "But tonight," he continued, "is the first time this space has felt complete." Silence deepened. He turned toward Eric. "A child reminded me this week that some of the most important moments in life are the ones we overlook." Eric looked up, confused but attentive. Weston shifted his gaze to Anita. "And a mother reminded me what strength looks like." Anita's breath caught. Weston walked slowly toward her. "You show up every day," he said, his voice steady but personal now. "Not just to work, but to protect, to nurture, to provide with dignity, even when it costs you." Anita's hands trembled slightly at her sides. "You never asked for help," he continued. "You never demanded attention. But you deserved both." The room remained perfectly still. Weston paused just a step away from her. "I built my life believing success was measured by what I could accumulate," he said. "But this week, I learned something different." He glanced at Eric again. "Success is measured by who you stand beside." Anita's heart pounded so loudly she was certain others could hear it. Weston took a slow breath. "Anita," he said clearly, so everyone could hear, "you have changed this house." Her eyes filled instantly. "You've changed me." A murmur rippled softly through the crowd. Weston's voice remained composed. I don't want tonight to be remembered only as Eric's first birthday with candles. He reached into his jacket pocket. Anita's pulse spiked. He removed a small velvet box. The room inhaled collectively. Eric blinked up at it. What's that? He asked. Weston didn't break eye contact with Anita. It's a question, he answered quietly. He lowered himself to one knee. The gesture sent a visible wave through the room. Anita's hand flew to her mouth. Her mother's fingers tightened around her arm. Anita, Weston said, looking up at her, I don't want to stand apart from you anymore. I don't want you and Eric to feel like guests in a world I control. His voice softened. I want you here. Not as staff, not as obligation. He opened the box. A simple ring caught the light. I want you here as family. The words settled heavily and beautifully at once. Will you move in with me? He asked. Will you let me share your burdens, your joys, your Sundays, your music? The silence in the room felt almost sacred. Anita's thoughts raced. This was more than romance, more than comfort. It was a crossing of lines, social, economic, personal. She thought of her small apartment in the 9th Ward, of neighbors who knew her name, of years spent guarding her pride carefully. She thought of how easily people judged relationships across status. She thought of Eric, standing only feet away, watching everything with wide eyes. And she thought of the past week. City Park, beignets under open sky, rain in the kitchen. A man who knelt beside her son without hesitation. Her mother leaned close and whispered softly, Follow your heart. Anita looked down at Weston. He wasn't smiling broadly. He wasn't performing. He was vulnerable, waiting. Eric tugged lightly at her dress. Mama? He whispered. She looked at him. Is he staying? Eric asked. Tears blurred her vision. She knelt down in front of her son first. How do you feel? She asked gently. Eric looked at Weston, then back at her. He listens, Eric said simply. That was enough. Anita stood slowly. She extended her hand toward Weston. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Yes, I will. The word echoed softly through the hall. For half a second, no one moved. Then applause erupted, louder than before, filled with genuine astonishment. Weston rose, sliding the ring onto her finger carefully. Eric cheered loudly, jumping up and down. Anita's mother wiped her eyes openly. The jazz band resumed playing, this time brighter, fuller. Weston wrapped one arm around Anita and lifted Eric slightly with the other. 3 lives, once separated by circumstance, now standing at the center of the same room. The billionaire's next move had not been a transaction. It had been transformation, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had just seen something rare. Not wealth displayed, but love declared. The morning after the celebration felt quieter than the night before. Not empty, settled. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, illuminating spaces that no longer felt formal or distant. Anita stood near the balcony doors, looking out over the Garden District streets below. The ring on her finger caught the light briefly, but she wasn't staring at it. She was thinking. Behind her, Eric ran across the hallway in socks, sliding slightly on polished floors. Mama, look, he called. Weston followed a few steps behind, holding a folded stack of papers. Careful, Weston warned, though there was laughter in his voice. Eric stopped in front of Anita. Are we staying here forever? The question carried excitement and uncertainty. Anita knelt to his level. We're building something new, she said carefully. But we don't forget where we came from. Eric nodded thoughtfully. I like my old room too. You can like both, Weston said gently, stepping closer. Anita glanced at him. That sentence mattered, because change, especially across worlds so different, required balance. Over the next few days, adjustments came quickly. Eric explored the mansion cautiously at first, counting the rooms, testing the echo of his voice in long hallways. He chose a bedroom with a window facing the oak trees and insisted on bringing his old blanket from the 9th Ward apartment. It smells like home, he explained. Anita agreed. Weston made no objections. At breakfast one morning, Anita hesitated before sitting at the main dining table. I can still work, she said. I don't want this to change who I am. Weston met her gaze. It doesn't, but people will talk, she added quietly. They always do, he replied. Let them. She studied his face carefully. This can't be charity dressed as romance. It isn't, he said firmly. She held his gaze a moment longer, measuring sincerity. Satisfied, she nodded. They visited the Ninth Ward together that weekend. Eric ran toward familiar sidewalks with equal enthusiasm. Neighbors watched curiously as Weston stepped out of the car beside Anita. The social divide didn't disappear overnight. Eyes followed, whispers floated, but Weston didn't shrink. And Anita didn't apologize. She introduced him simply. This is Weston, nothing more, nothing less. Eric moved easily between both worlds, the mansion and the modest streets, without confusion. Children adjust faster than adults. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Anita turned to Weston. This isn't just about us, she said. He nodded. I know. It's about what we show him. Weston looked toward Eric, who was building another small block tower on the floor. Then we show him that respect travels both ways, he answered. Anita smiled faintly. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning that required intention, and they were stepping into it fully. In the weeks that followed, subtle changes reshaped the mansion more than any renovation ever could. Weston began coming home earlier, not because his workload had lessened, it hadn't, but because he no longer saw late nights at the office as proof of dedication. Some evenings he found Eric in the living room, waiting with a small football tucked under his arm. 5 throws, Eric would insist. Weston would loosen his tie, roll up his sleeves, and count them out carefully. Anita watched from the doorway more than once, noticing how naturally those moments fit into the house now. The dining table, once used mostly for formal meetings, became a place for shared meals. Anita cooked occasionally, simple dishes from her childhood, and Weston listened when she explained where each recipe came from. He didn't correct. He didn't critique. He tasted and asked for seconds. Staff members adjusted as well. The hierarchy that once defined the mansion softened. Conversations became easier. Laughter echoed more frequently through hallways that had once carried only quiet footsteps. One afternoon, Anita found Weston sitting at the long table with documents spread before him. Work? She asked. Yes, he replied. But different. She walked closer. He slid a paper toward her. It outlined a new foundation initiative focused on community access, park programs, youth activities, neighborhood celebrations. Why? She asked gently. Because I overlooked too much, he answered. Not intentionally, but still. Anita studied him. You're not trying to fix everything at once, are you? He gave a faint smile. No. Just starting where I can see. She appreciated that. Transformation, she knew, should never erase humility. Despite her new surroundings, Anita maintained her routines. She still woke early, still sang softly in the kitchen while preparing breakfast, still visited the Ninth Ward regularly. The difference was that now, Weston joined her sometimes. He didn't try to lead those visits. He followed. One evening, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows and Eric fell asleep on the couch between them, Weston spoke quietly. I used to measure wealth in square footage and contracts, he said. Anita rested her head lightly against the back of the couch. And now? She asked. He looked at Eric. Now I measure it in moments I don't want to miss. The mansion no longer felt like an achievement. It felt like a home. Some stories change because of wealth. This one changed because of attention. A child asked a simple question. A mother carried quiet strength. A man who had everything realized he had overlooked something small and powerful. The night Eric blew out 4 candles was not about frosting or music or even celebration. It was about being seen. Compassion does not require status. It requires awareness. Weston could have ignored that kitchen moment. He could have nodded politely and returned to meetings. But instead, he chose to listen. And listening led to action. Anita never asked for rescue. She asked only for dignity. She had already built a world for her son filled with faith, resilience, and love. Weston didn't replace that. He joined it. The truth is simple. Every child deserves candles, not because of money, not because of class, but because every child deserves a moment where the room grows quiet, where hope gathers, where a wish feels possible. That night in the mansion did more than surprise guests. It redefined success. It showed that generosity crosses boundaries. It proved that leadership is not only about influence, it is about presence. If this story moved you, if you believe compassion should outweigh status, take a moment right now. Like this video, comment below what stood out to you most. Subscribe to Mr. Gray Family for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us what truly matters. And share this with someone who needs to remember that small acts can reshape entire lives. Because sometimes change doesn't begin with a contract. It begins with a child's voice in a quiet kitchen and a decision to answer it.